The Helix 7 asteroid mining station existed in that peculiar state of organized chaos that could only be achieved when 17 different species tried to run a business together while pretending they understood each other's tax codes. Floating somewhere between the third and fourth moons of Centauri Prime, it served as a testament to the galaxy's most ambitious experiment, proving that bureaucracy could indeed transcend species barriers and become universally incompetent. Humans, in this grand cosmic comedy, had somehow landed the role of maintenance species, which sounded far more dignified than the guys who fix stuff when it breaks. The Galactic Trade Consortium had determined, through methods that definitely didn't involve bribing the assessment committee, that humans possessed an unusual aptitude for dealing with broken things. This included everything from malfunctioning atmospheric processors to the shattered dreams of middle management. Ophelia Crane had been delivering tools to various corners of Helix 7 for 3 years, 4 months and 16 days. Not that she was counting or anything. She possessed the kind of professional competence that made supervisors uncomfortable, mainly because she actually read the instruction manuals and occasionally asked inconvenient questions like why and are you sure about that? Her efficiency ratings were so high that corporate had started assigning her the jobs nobody else wanted, which apparently qualified as a promotion in the Byzantine logic of interstellar commerce. The morning started like any other, with Ophelia's alarm playing the soothing sounds of a Viridian rainforest, followed immediately by the harsh buzz of the emergency override that meant corporate had decided to make her day interesting. She rolled out of her regulation-sized bunk, in her regulation-sized quarters, and stared at the regulation-sized mirror that reflected back a face that had seen too many regulation-sized portions of synthetic protein. Her hair looked like it had been styled by someone who understood gravity but had never personally experienced it. The station's artificial atmosphere had a habit of doing things to human hair that physics textbooks would probably describe as inadvisable, but Ophelia had long since given up trying to look like anything other than a person who lived in a metal can floating through space. The assignment waiting on her personal datapad made her pause, mid-coffee sip. Emergency delivery to Sector 7G. The notation alone was enough to make her wonder if someone in corporate had confused her personnel file with someone who actually enjoyed mortal peril. Sector 7G was where they'd relocated the Apex for former miners, who'd supposedly gone feral after prolonged exposure to whatever it was that made people go feral these days. The corporate briefings on the subject had been refreshingly vague, which in corporate speak meant we have no idea what we're talking about, but we're confident it's someone else's problem. According to the delivery manifest, she was supposed to transport a Class A emergency toolkit to the sector's outer maintenance bay. The toolkit itself was a marvel of engineering redundancy. 47 different types of wrenches, 32 varieties of screwdrivers, and enough spare parts to rebuild a small shuttle. It was also, according to the hazard assessment, worth approximately the same as a mid-sized luxury apartment on New Geneva. The bureaucratic paperwork accompanying this simple delivery was impressive in its thoroughness. Ophelia found herself signing waivers that covered everything from accidental dismemberment to voluntary possession by hostile entities. There was even a form acknowledging that corporate was not responsible for any temporal displacement events that might occur during the delivery process, which seemed oddly specific for a company that officially didn't believe in time travel. Her supervisor, a pleasant enough fellow named Hendricks, who had the look of someone who discovered that middle management was actually a form of purgatory, handed her the final authorization codes, with an expression that suggested he was either deeply concerned for her welfare or trying to remember where he'd put his lunch. Standard delivery protocol, he said, which was corporate speak for try not to die, but if you do, please fill out the appropriate forms first. The toolkit weighed approximately the same as a small asteroid and came with its own anti-gravity sled, which was fortunate because Ophelia had no intention of carrying it through the station's more questionable corridors. The sled's navigation system had been programmed with the route to Sector 7G, though it seemed to have been programmed by someone who viewed the concept of direct path as a personal challenge to their creativity. As she maneuvered through the station's main thoroughfares, Ophelia couldn't help but notice the way other residents looked at her cargo. There was something in their expressions that suggested they knew something she didn't, which was hardly unusual on a station where information flowed like molasses through a bureaucratic filter. But there was also something that looked suspiciously like pity, which was significantly more concerning. The journey to Sector 7G took her through progressively emptier corridors. The cheerful corporate motivational posters gradually gave way to warning signs that became increasingly creative in their descriptions of potential hazards. By the time she reached the outer maintenance bay, she was passing notices that advised against feeding the inhabitants and making direct eye contact, which seemed like the kind of advice that would have been helpful earlier in the briefing process. The maintenance bay itself was a testament to the concept of good enough engineering. It had clearly been designed by someone who understood the basic principles of keeping air inside and space outside, but had perhaps been less concerned with aesthetics or comfort. The lighting flickered in a pattern that suggested the electrical system was engaged in some kind of philosophical debate with itself. Ophelia positioned the toolkit according to the delivery specifications and began the process of logging the completion of her assignment. The paperwork was, naturally, more complex than the actual delivery. She was halfway through documenting the precise atmospheric conditions when she heard something that made her pause. It sounded like someone was rummaging through her toolkit. The corporate briefings had been quite specific about what to do if she encountered one of the Apex. Retreat immediately, report the incident, and under no circumstances attempt to engage in conversation. They hadn't mentioned what to do if the Apex appeared to be conducting an inventory of precision tools with the methodical patience of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. Ophelia turned around slowly, half expecting to see the kind of feral creature that corporate safety videos had prepared her for. Instead, she found herself looking at someone who was very obviously not feral, unless feral had recently been redefined to include organized, and wearing a remarkably well-maintained jumpsuit. The person looked up from the toolkit with an expression that suggested they were as surprised to see her as she was to see them. For a moment they regarded each other with the kind of mutual uncertainty that typically preceded either violence or awkward small talk. Then the person noticed her hair. "Oh, honey," they said, and their voice carried the kind of genuine concern that Ophelia hadn't heard in months. "What did that helmet do to you?" Ophelia's hand instinctively moved toward the emergency beacon on her utility belt, then froze as her brain processed what she was actually seeing. The person examining her toolkit wasn't displaying any of the behaviors corporates had described in their extensive Apex encounter protocols. There was no snarling, no wild gesticulation, and certainly no attempt to fashion weapons from the precision instruments. Instead, they were holding a sonic calibrator with the kind of reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. "I'm sorry," Ophelia said, because politeness had been drilled into her since childhood and apparently survived even potentially life-threatening situations. "I was told this area was restricted." The person, who appeared to be human, though corporate's briefings had been frustratingly vague about what exactly the Apex was supposed to be, looked up with eyes that held the kind of intelligence that suggested they'd spend considerable time thinking about things more complex than where their next meal was coming from. "Oh, it is," they replied, carefully placing the calibrator back in its designated slot. "Restricted to people who actually know what they're doing. I'm Blaze Carver, former senior mining engineer, current resident of the sectors that corporate pretends don't exist." They paused, studying Ophelia's face with the kind of attention that made her wonder if she had something stuck in her teeth. "And you're the poor soul they sent to deliver tools to the monsters." Ophelia blinked. "You're not going to try to kill me? With what, a torque wrench?" Blaze gestured at the toolkit with amusement. "Besides, I'm more concerned about your hair situation. That helmet really did a number on you, didn't it?" Looking down at Blaze's hands, Ophelia noticed something that corporate's briefings definitely hadn't mentioned. Perfectly manicured nails, and what appeared to be traces of styling gel. This was not the appearance of someone who had descended into feral savagery. This was the appearance of someone who had access to a surprisingly well-stocked beauty supply. "I don't understand," Ophelia said, which was becoming a familiar refrain in her interactions with anything related to corporate policy. The briefing said the Apex were dangerous, violent, that they'd attack anyone who entered their territory. Blaze made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been quite so bitter. "Corporate says a lot of things. They also said our sector was being temporarily relocated for essential maintenance 3 years ago." They moved closer, and Ophelia found herself oddly comforted by the fact that someone who was supposedly feral smelled like quality shampoo. May you what? Fix your hair. I realize this is probably not how you expected this encounter to go, But I used to run a salon before I went into mining. Old habits die hard, and your hair is, honestly, making my professional sensibilities weep." Ophelia stared at them. In all her years of delivering tools to various corners of the galaxy, she had never once been offered an impromptu styling session by someone who was supposed to be a dangerous savage. The universe, she reflected, had a truly remarkable sense of humor. "This is highly irregular," she said, which was corporate speak for, "I have no idea what protocol covers this situation. Funny, everything about this situation is irregular. Corporate sent you here with a toolkit that's worth more than most people's annual salaries, told you we were monsters, and didn't bother to mention that we're the ones who've been keeping the life support systems running in the sectors they abandoned." Blaze reached into what Ophelia now realized was a remarkably well-organized tool belt and produced a brush that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood both engineering and aesthetics. "Now, are you going to let me help you look like a professional, or are you going to go back to your supervisors looking like you stuck your finger in an electrical socket?" The logical part of Ophelia's brain pointed out that accepting grooming services from someone corporate had classified as hostile was probably not covered under her insurance policy. The practical part of her brain pointed out that her hair did indeed look like a disaster, and she had a performance review coming up next week. "I suppose," she said carefully, "that would be acceptable." What followed was possibly the most surreal experience of Ophelia's career. Blaze worked with a kind of focused concentration that suggested they were solving a complex engineering problem, which, in a way, they were. They explained as they worked that the station's artificial atmosphere created static charges that played havoc with human hair, and that the standard corporate-issued helmets were designed by someone who had apparently never seen human hair in its natural state. "The trick," Blaze said, working through a particularly stubborn tangle, "is understanding that hair is essentially organic fiber with specific tensile properties. You treat it like any other material, with respect for its structural limitations and an understanding of how environmental factors affect its behavior." "You're an engineer," Ophelia said, and it wasn't a question. "I was an engineer, now I'm whatever corporate needs me to be to justify abandoning us out here." Blaze's hands moved with practiced efficiency, transforming Ophelia's hair from a disaster into something that looked intentional. "Though, between you and me, I think my current job description is convenient scapegoat for systemic infrastructure failures. But the briefing said you were dangerous." "We are dangerous. We're dangerous because we know how things actually work around here." Blaze stepped back to admire their work, then made a small adjustment that somehow made everything look even better. "We're dangerous because we kept detailed records of every safety violation, every corner that was cut, every system that was allowed to fail because fixing it would have impacted quarterly profits." Ophelia caught sight of herself in the reflective surface of the toolkit's housing and barely recognized her own face. Her hair looked like it had been styled by someone who actually cared about the end result, which was a novelty in her experience with corporate services. "This is impossible," she said, touching her hair experimentally. "Corporate doesn't make mistakes this big." "Oh, they don't make mistakes," Blaze said, cleaning their brush with the kind of care that suggested it was a prized possession. "They make calculated decisions. It's much easier to relocate a few hundred people and call them dangerous than it is to admit that your profit margins depend on ignoring basic safety protocols." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Ophelia's hand moved toward her emergency beacon again, but Blaze's expression was one of mild interest rather than alarm. "That'll be the others," Blaze said. "Don't worry, they're probably just curious about the toolkit. We don't get many deliveries these days, and certainly not ones that come with genuine corporate authorization codes." The footsteps resolved into people, more people than Ophelia had expected, and all of them looking significantly less feral than corporate's briefings had suggested. They wore clean clothes, moved with purpose, and several of them were carrying what appeared to be technical equipment that had been modified in ways that suggested both creativity and competence. "New friend?" asked one of them, a woman whose jumpsuit bore the kind of stains that suggested she'd been working with machinery rather than, say, fashioning primitive weapons from scrap metal. "Tool delivery specialist," Blaze replied. "I was just explaining to her that we're not actually the monsters corporate makes us out to be." "Well," said another voice from the back of the group, "that depends on your definition of monster." Everyone turned to look at the speaker, who was emerging from the shadows with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested they'd been waiting for the right moment to make an entrance. Ophelia found herself wondering if this was finally the dangerous savage she'd been warned about. Instead, she found herself looking at someone who appeared to be carrying a tea service. The person with the tea service turned out to be named Ember Chen, and they had the kind of serene expression that suggested they'd achieved enlightenment through the proper steeping of herbal blends. They also had the kind of technical modifications on their equipment that suggested they could probably rewire the entire station's power grid while simultaneously brewing a perfect cup of chamomile. "I thought you might need refreshments," Ember said, setting down a tray that had clearly been constructed from repurposed mining equipment but somehow managed to look elegant. Encounters with corporate representatives can be quite taxing, even when they're pleasant ones. Ophelia accepted the offered cup with the kind of confusion that was becoming her default emotional state. The tea was actually quite good, which somehow made the entire situation even more surreal. She had been prepared for violence, chaos, and possibly death. She had not been prepared for hospitality that rivaled the executive lounges back at corporate headquarters. "I don't understand any of this," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said in months. Understanding corporate policy is a bit like trying to decode a foreign language written by someone who was actively having a stroke, said Blaze, accepting their own cup with obvious pleasure. "The key is to remember that none of it has to make sense as long as it serves the bottom line." Ember nodded sagely. "For instance, it's much cheaper to classify us as hostile entities than it is to admit that relocating us was actually a way of cutting infrastructure costs. If we're dangerous, then corporate isn't responsible for maintaining our life support systems." "But you're clearly not dangerous," Ophelia pointed out, gesturing at the tea service and her remarkably improved hair. "Oh, we're extremely dangerous," said the woman with the stained jumpsuit, who had introduced herself as Wren Holloway, former chief systems engineer. "We're dangerous because we documented every single safety violation that corporate tried to sweep under the rug. We're dangerous because we kept backups of all the maintenance records they tried to delete. And we're dangerous because we know exactly how much money they've been saving by pretending we don't exist." Ophelia was beginning to understand that dangerous was apparently corporate speak for inconveniently competent. "Would you like to see what we've been up to?" Blaze asked, finishing their tea with obvious satisfaction. "Since you're here anyway, and you seem like the kind of person who might appreciate irony." What followed was a tour that completely redefined Velia's understanding of what constituted abandoned sectors. The areas that corporate had classified as uninhabitable and structurally compromised turned out to be remarkably well-maintained, efficiently organized, and significantly more pleasant than the supposedly premium quarters she'd been assigned in the official residential sectors. The Apex had taken the mining equipment that corporate had been too cheap to remove and turned it into something that looked like a cross between a community center and a technical college. Drilling platforms had been converted into hydroponic gardens. Ore processing units had been transformed into workshops where people were creating everything from furniture to what appeared to be advanced atmospheric processors. "The best part," Ran explained as they walked through a corridor that had been decorated with murals that would have looked at home in any major art gallery, "is that corporate takes credit for all of this. The improved air quality, the enhanced power efficiency, the reduced maintenance costs. They report it all as successful infrastructure upgrades." "But you're the ones doing the work," Ophelia said. "Of course we are. Corfit's official maintenance crew spend most of their time filling out forms about why they can't actually fix anything. We don't have to worry about requisition orders or environmental impact assessments. We just fix what's broken." They paused at what had once been a mining control center and was now something that looked like a cross between a spa and a technical laboratory. Several people were working on various projects while simultaneously receiving what appeared to be professional quality manicures and haircuts. "Multitasking," Blaze explained, noticing Ophelia's expression. "Why waste time when you can maintain both your equipment and your appearance simultaneously?" "This is impossible," Ophelia said, though she was beginning to realize that she'd been saying that a lot lately. "Corporate would never allow this level of civilization." "Corporate doesn't know about it," Ember said, settling into a chair that had clearly been designed by someone who understood both ergonomics and aesthetics. "Officially, we're all feral savages who can barely operate basic tools. Unofficially, we're running the most efficient operation on the entire station." The tour continued through areas that defied every assumption Ophelia had made about abandoned infrastructure. The Apex had not only maintained the systems corporate had left behind, they'd improved them. The lighting was better than in the official sectors. The air quality was noticeably fresher. The common areas were actually designed for human comfort rather than efficient space utilization. The really beautiful part, Wren said as they passed through what appeared to be a library that had been built into a former ore storage facility, is that corporate efficiency reports keep improving because of our work, but they can't figure out why. They've been trying to reverse engineer their own success for 3 years, but surely they must know, Ophelia said. The reports, the maintenance records, the power consumption data, someone must have noticed the patterns. Oh, they noticed, Blaze said, with the kind of smile that suggested they'd been waiting for this question. They noticed that certain sectors were performing above expectations. They noticed that maintenance costs were dropping while efficiency was rising. They noticed that the systems they had supposedly abandoned were somehow maintaining themselves. And, Ophelia prompted, and they classified it as a trade secret, Ember said, pouring fresh tea from a pot that had been crafted from what looked like a precision-machined valve assembly. Corporate policy now lists a Helix 7 efficiency protocol as proprietary technology that must be protected from industrial espionage. Ah, I didn't realize how many engineers there were, he added. His tone was awkward, which was careful to be. They're taking credit for your work while simultaneously trying to exterminate you? Culprit has never been troubled by logical consistency, Wren observed. Though exterminate is a rather strong word. They prefer decommission or restructure or implement atmospheric reclamation procedures. Atmospheric reclamation procedures? They're planning to vent the atmosphere from our sectors, Blaze explained with a kind of casual tone that suggested they were discussing the weather. Officially, it's to eliminate the biological hazards that have supposedly developed in the abandoned areas. Unofficially, it's because someone in corporate finally realized that we might be keeping records of things they'd rather forget. They're going to kill everyone next week, according to the maintenance schedules we've been monitoring. Corporate's really quite thorough about documenting their atrocities, as long as they can file them under routine maintenance. Ophelia sat down heavily in the nearest chair, which turned out to be surprisingly comfortable. This is insane. You're keeping the station running, they're taking credit for your work, and now they're planning to murder you all to cover it up. Corporate efficiency at its finest, Ember said, refilling Ophelia's cup. Though I suppose it's only murder if you acknowledge that we're people rather than problematic infrastructure elements. But you have proof of all this. Oh, we have proof of everything, Wren said, gesturing toward a wall display that showed what appeared to be 3 years' worth of maintenance records, safety reports, and efficiency analyses. The question is whether anyone in a position to do something about it would be willing to listen. Ophelia stared at the display, her mind racing. Corporate had sent her here to deliver tools to people they'd classified as dangerous savages. Instead, she'd found the most competent, civilized, and thoroughly documented engineering operation she'd ever encountered. And now corporate was planning to eliminate them, to cover up their own incompetence. What if, she said slowly, someone with corporate authorization codes were to make sure this information reached the right people? The sudden silence that followed her question was the kind of silence that suggested everyone in the room was simultaneously having the same thought. This, Blay said eventually, would be extremely dangerous. More dangerous than doing nothing and letting corporate murder all of you? Oh, taken. Ophelia's decision to commit career suicide by exposing corporate's most profitable cover-up was surprisingly easy to make. Perhaps it was the quality of the tea, or maybe it was the fact that her hair had never looked better. But she found herself accessing her authorization codes with a kind of calm determination that usually preceded either heroic acts or spectacular failures. Broadcasting to all station frequencies, she announced, her fingers dancing across the communication panel with practiced efficiency. This is Tool Delivery Specialist Ophelia Crane, Corporate Authorization Level 7, with an urgent infrastructure update. The response was immediate and predictably hysterical. Her personal communicator began buzzing with increasingly frantic messages from Hendricks, who seemed to be having some kind of breakdown that involved a lot of capital letters and creative punctuation. Corporate security was apparently mobilizing, though given their typical response time, the Apex would probably have time to finish their current manicures before anyone arrived. Station residents, Ophelia continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 years of dealing with corporate bureaucracy. You have been systematically lied to about the inhabitants of sectors 7G through 7M. These individuals are not dangerous savages. They are the engineers and technicians who have been maintaining your life support systems, improving your power efficiency, and keeping you alive while corporate takes credit for their work. The evidence dump that followed was thorough, methodical, and absolutely devastating. 3 years of maintenance records, safety reports that corporate had tried to delete, efficiency analyses that proved the abandoned sectors were actually outperforming the official ones, and, most damning of all, the atmospheric reclamation schedule that would have quietly eliminated everyone who knew the truth. Corporate security finally arrived just as Ophelia was finishing her broadcast, though they seemed somewhat confused by the fact that the dangerous hostiles they'd been sent to rescue her from were offering them refreshments and asking if they'd like their uniforms pressed. "This is highly irregular," announced Security Chief Morrison, who had the kind of expression that suggested he'd been trained for many scenarios, but none of them had involved tea service. "Everything about this situation is irregular," Blaze replied, offering him a perfectly brewed cup of something that smelled like it had been crafted by someone who understood both chemistry and customer service. "But perhaps we could discuss it like civilized people." What followed was the kind of negotiation that would probably be studied in business schools for decades, assuming anyone survived to write the case study. The Apex presented their evidence with the kind of professional competence that made corporate's official reports look like they'd been written by particularly unimaginative children. Corporate security found themselves in the awkward position of trying to arrest people who were demonstrably keeping the station functional. The final blow came when Wren casually mentioned that the Apex had been monitoring corporate communications and had complete records of every conversation about the atmospheric reclamation project, including the parts where executives discussed how much money they'd save by eliminating the infrastructure elements who knew too much. By the time the dust settled, corporate had found itself in the unprecedented position of having to acknowledge that their most successful operation was being run by people they'd officially classified as non-existent. The station's residents, having discovered that their lives depended on the competence of people they'd been taught to fear, decided that perhaps corporate's management philosophy needed some revision. The irony reached its peak when corporate, faced with the choice between admitting incompetence or promoting competence, chose the path of least resistance. The Apex were officially reclassified as essential personnel and given administrative control over the sectors they'd been maintaining all along. Corporate managed to spin this as a successful integration initiative that demonstrated their commitment to innovative management solutions. Ophelia found herself with a new job title, Apex Liaison Specialist, which apparently meant she got paid to hang out with the people she'd been sent to fear. Her duties included regular meetings with Blaze, who had been appointed as the station's new wellness coordinator and took their responsibility for her hair maintenance very seriously. "You know," Blaze said during one of their weekly sessions, working through Ophelia's hair with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were solving complex engineering problems. "Corporate was right about one thing. We really are dangerous." "How so?" "We're dangerous because we prove that people can be competent, efficient, and civilized without corporate management." Blaze paused, considering their work. "Though I suppose that's always been the most terrifying possibility of all." Ophelia had to admit that her hair had never looked better, and neither had her performance reviews. 6 months later, Helix 7 had become the most efficient mining station in the sector, though corporate's press releases credited this to their revolutionary management restructuring initiative. The Apex sectors were now officially known as the Excellence Centers, and tours were given to executives from other stations who wanted to learn the secret of corporate success. Ophelia's hair remained impeccable, maintained through weekly appointments with Blaze, who had developed a thriving side business in executive grooming services. Corporate had somehow convinced themselves that good hair was essential to operational efficiency, which was probably the most accidentally correct conclusion they'd reached in decades. The universe, it seemed, had an excellent sense of ironic justice.